As we hurtle around the sun one more time and hold on to anything that we can in 2022, let me start off by saying Happy New Year. I'm Shuvaloy Majumdar, Program Director for Foreign Policy and Munk Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and welcome to our polling presentation on Canada's role in the world. To begin with, let me start off with some acknowledgements. First of all, we're grateful to the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, who our partners and friends have enabled us to conduct this important research and present these findings to you. I want to acknowledge our incredible colleagues at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, both on the back end and on the communications team, particularly to Brett Byers-Lane, who has been absolutely essential in pulling together this work over the last couple of I'd say weeks, but month. It's been a hard push, and my hat tip to you, my friend. You've done a great job. And of course, to Hamish Marshall from One Persuades, who worked with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in developing the survey design and deploying the poll. It's just excellent work. Of course, our great team, including Brett, should be bought a cup of coffee. We're a public policy think tank, and as such, I would be remiss not to invite you to visit macdonaldlaurier.ca to click on the donate button and buy Brett a cup of coffee. I'm sure he'd appreciate it. I'm sure that our entire team would be grateful for your support in this new year and ongoing as we undertake the important work of exploring Canada's interests in a disrupted world. So let me get to the point of why we're here today. What do Canadians think, actually, about our country's place in the world? What are our country's foreign policy priorities? What are Canadians' attitudes toward our allies as well as our adversaries? And which countries pose the greatest threats to Canada? What do Canadians think about multilateral organizations? Public opinion polling provides an opportunity to learn the insights of Canadians and their international priorities. It is a basis from which the Canadian strategic community can offer comment and build upon our statecraft as we fashion what our Canadian foreign policy should be around the world. These questions and more are part of this second annual Foreign Policy and International Affairs Survey, a commission, again, with the support of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. And so today, I'm joined by friends, partners, colleagues, first and foremost, Senior Fellow and Indo-Pacific Program Director, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and Senior Fellow and Transatlantic Program Lead, Balkan Devlen, who led in the development of this poll. So to provide an overview of our results, discuss their implications for Canadian foreign policy, and to situate them within the context of the multiple challenges Canada is facing at the international level, today we would go over some brief slide highlights that our colleagues here will have a chance to delve into, engage in a bit of a conversation, and then open up the opportunity for your questions, your comments, which we will be monitoring and try to attend to in the brief amount of time that we have together. The complete survey and its results are available at www.macdonaldlaurier.ca. We invite you to check them out, download them, share them, and engage us in a discussion and dialogue around what our priorities should be as a country. So to kick off this discussion, let's begin with a review of some of the key highlights. I'm going to ask our colleagues to pull up the first slide that we have, which provide our findings on the net impression that Canadians have of other countries. So to kick it off, Jonathan, over to you. Walk us through what you see.
Well, thanks so much, Shuv, and welcome to our audience tuning in from all across Canada and those who are watching from further afield. So you can see in this slide some of the three key points to kind of highlight. The first one is that Canadians continue to be persistently pessimistic and have pessimistic views on our adversaries, namely China and Russia. Indeed, almost 7 in 10 Canadians believe China poses a threat to Canada, which is the highest of any country in this survey. The second important point to look at through this map is on the allies side. So some of the key ally relationships that Canadians see most positively include Australia, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan. The third important point to think about, and we'll tease into this point a little bit later, is the, of course, consequential relationship with the United States. There's been almost a 60% swing in net favorability, net impressions with regard to the United States as a result of the change of administrations. So from last year, from a minus 44% net impression to a plus 16% impression. So those are the general takeaways from this first slide.
Excellent. And now we do have the opportunity to reflect on this as the second annual poll. So Balkan, I'm going to turn to you now, and maybe you can provide our viewers a sense as to what's changed in the last year.
Thank you, Shu, and it's great that we will be able to take these out and discuss with the audience today. Jonathan highlighted some of the important changes. The United States, the favorability ratings for the U.S. really flipped significantly, over a 40% change from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. So that's one of the bigger ones. I would also highlight the fact that both Russia and China, although still heavily view as negative, those views are softened somewhat, though did not to the extent that it creates a meaningful change in the negative views. I would also highlight two of the other allies that have a significant increase in the positivity compared to last year. One is Israel, that went from a negative net impression score to a positive impression score. And the other one is Ukraine. Again, went from a negative impression score to a significantly positive impression score.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. There's a lot to unpack on that first point, but I want to move along to the major highlights that we have here. So the next slide that we have for our viewers are a sense of what Canadians think about threats to Canada. So if we could pull up that slide, I'm going to now turn to Balkan to walk us through what we see here.
So when we look at this map, what we immediately see is the three countries that is really seen as serious threats to Canada and Canadian security. Number one is China, 36%, more than one third of Canadians see China as a serious threat. When we combine this with who perceive China as a threat, a moderate threat, we are about 70%. Which has the highest amount of any country that we have asked. Russia and Afghanistan, ruled by Taliban, comes close second after China. We also see Iran being perceived as a serious threat to Canada by 0.25% of the population.
Wonderful. Thank you, Balkan. Turning to the next set of topics, which include Canadians' views of international organizations. Jonathan, why don't you walk us through what we see on this slide? You might be on mute.
Sorry about that. There's two main takeaways here to look at. The first main takeaway is that Canadians generally are quite positive favorability on international institutions and multilateral institutions. The second takeaway, though, is within that, embedded within that, you can see certain institutions are more favorable than others. So in this slide, we see that the Five Eyes, for example, so the traditional Anglo intelligence sharing grouping, has a 55 net impression score, whereas other large-scale multilateral institutions, such as the United Nations, have a 35, the WHO with a 34. So what we're seeing here, and NATO as well with a quite high favorability of 37, is the smaller, more interest-focused groups are very much appreciated by Canadians, while there's a little bit more skepticism, while it's still general favorability with the large-scale international institutions.
It's an interesting thing. I noticed there's a 20-point spread between support for Five Eyes and to the United Nations. It shows you where Canadians, I think, are emphasizing the priority. Moving along to the next slide, standing up for democracies. Balkan, why don't you walk viewers through what we see here?
So I think this is a very important slide because the way we ask the question. We ask Canadians their willingness to stand up for democracies in parts of the world where we have limited strategic interests. So, it's easy to support when we have clear-cut interests abroad, but we also ask, should we stand up for democracies? And a significant percentage of Canadians, which you can see here, almost 6 in 10 Canadians should believe that we should stand up for democracies, even if our strategic interests are not at stake. And this is true across, as you can see in the graph. This is true across demographic and geographic distribution and different populations, which suggests a broad-based support among Canadians that believe that we should stand with other democracies in the world, even if our immediate interests are not at stake.
Balkan, on this slide, before we move along, I noticed on that question of demography, in this poll, I see that we spent some particular attention in some Canadian municipalities. Do you want to speak to a little bit why we did that?
Sure. One of the reasons why we wanted to engage with both the Greater Vancouver area and the Greater Toronto area is twofold: to highlight the participation of these urban areas who also have new Canadians, as well as minorities heavily present in these areas, to understand and get their views on opinion polling, which sometimes is being ignored. And we also wanted to see whether there is a difference between the coastal sort of urban metro areas with the rest of the country, so that we will have a better sense of how this particular spread is affected.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, on to the question of democracies versus multilateral organizations, our next slide. There we are. Jonathan, why don't you walk our viewers through what you see here?
Okay, so here you can see there's a couple interesting data points here. I think that we see some of the points that Balkan had mentioned previously, that while Canadians generally are very supportive of multilateral institutions, they also are very supportive of promoting democracy and working alongside with democracies. And I think this dovetails very closely with the initial slide, Shuv, that we talked about when we looked at net impressions. And we highlighted that the key partners that Canada thinks about the most favorably are indeed actually our key democratic allies. So what I think you're seeing here in this slide is that not only do we want to work in multilateral institutions, but we see that as a necessary but perhaps insufficient tool to work with, and that we also think that we should be pursuing other arrangements that are done in tandem with our democratic allies.
Excellent. We're going to keep it with you, Jonathan, because the next set of slides speak to something that I think is a major strategic priority for Canada today, as we hear often about an Indo-Pacific strategy being formed in Ottawa. Why don't we take a deeper dive into the Indo-Pacific? Jonathan, walk us through what Canadians seem to think in terms of their partnership potential with other democracies in the Indo-Pacific region.
What I think you're seeing here, Shiv, is that as Canada continues to develop its approach to the Indo-Pacific, and hopefully we see a strategy in the coming months on this, that the backbone of that strategy needs to be done in tandem with the key democratic partners and allies in this region. And I think, as we highlighted in the opening slide, some of those partners would include countries such as Australia and Japan, but also we should note the importance of the India relationship. And while it doesn't necessarily have the same favorability net score countries such as Australia and Japan, I think Canadians still recognize the importance of strong ties and relations with India. So I do see this as a key pillar to the way that Canadians think about engaging with this region, is not just about free trade agreements and business arrangements, but also the future of democracy in the region.
Thank you. Now, you've written and spoken a lot about this new Australia, United Kingdom, United States pact that was developed across the region. Our next slide should speak to this a little bit, because it's a really interesting platform for these countries to collaborate, not just on submarines, but on much bigger things, right, Jonathan?
Absolutely. I think the AUKUS deal, rather than this being framed as just a tactical deal about nuclear submarines between three countries, is about something much bigger. I think it's about defense technology. It's about the future of the way that democracies see the Indo-Pacific region and the threats to that region. And Canada needs to be a part of that discussion. I think Canadians will recognize that. I think this slide clearly shows that. And I think, again, this links back to the point that we talked about. While Canadians are generally favorable on multilateral institutions, this should not be to say that they do not favor other arrangements that are also in their interests, including unilateral arrangements like AUKUS. So I think this very much bodes well for Canada trying to be involved and engaged in the AUKUS in the future.
Many thanks. Many thanks. I'm just reviewing these data slides because I'm nerding out with you. Sorry. I think, participating in these, unique alliances, whether security-based or otherwise, raises questions about, how much are Canadians really willing to spend? Defense spending remains a perennial issue, particularly in the context of the present review being led by Minister Anita Anand. So, Balkan, walk us through how Canadians feel about defense spending at large.
Thanks, Sue. I think this is an important point, and we have been asking this question last year by giving a clear sense of what Canada is spending on its defense, both as a percentage of the federal spending, but also in actual dollars. And in both cases, what we see is that 4 in 10 Canadians support an increase, significant increase in defense spending. Another 4 in 10 suggest at least maintaining the same level. So when you look at it, 8 in 10 Canadians support at least keeping the defense spending today at the current levels to give us an ability to be able to provide the necessary capabilities in this more dangerous and turbulent world.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And, recently we had our national elections, and the question of what other state actors might be doing inside Canada to affect outcomes is obviously a very big topic, Balkan. Why don't you walk us through our next slide, foreign interference?
This is an extremely important point and have been a matter of discussion and public debate recently as well. Our MLI colleague, Marcus Kolga, and Disinfowatch has been leading the charge in warning Canadians about the foreign interference for a long while, including in the last federal elections. What we see in this particular chart is that 1 in 4 Canadians believe that there was interference by foreign governments or their agents in the federal elections. I would like to highlight one important aspect in this, and we don't see this here in this chart, but you can see it in the full report. There is very little partisan difference here when it comes to perceptions about foreign interference. In other words, those who vote for Liberal or for Conservatives are roughly on the same page when they see whether they see foreign interference or not, which suggests that this is a non-partisan issue in Canada, unlike some other countries.
Excellent, thank you. Now let's take a step back from these slides, because I know we've only provided just 6 or 7 slides as highlights to Canadians through this presentation today. And again, on Macdonald-Laurier.ca, viewers will be able to access much more detailed findings of our poll, including a written narrative analysis and breakouts that'll allow them to kind of get a better appreciation for some of the more granular issues that these slides present. But let me turn to you, Jonathan, now, kind of to take a step back from these 6, 7 things that we talked about, whether it's spanning perceptions of international organizations or prioritizing interests in the Indo-Pacific. Jonathan, when you take a full look at the survey's results, what are some of your high-level takeaways that have stayed with you now that you've gone through the data?
Well, I think a couple things. So first of all, I think Canadians are very clear-eyed about who their friends are and who their adversaries are. So this is something that we've noted in both years that we've done this polling. There has been some changes from year to year, but generally we know, and I think Balkan has outlined some of these adversaries during his discussion as well. We know who our challenges are and where our challenges are coming from, and we know who our friends are. The challenge, I think, comes is how do we deal with that? So thinking about institutions, thinking about some of the main issues that represent those challenges, that's something that we generally have favorability on many of the organizations that could potentially deal with that, but really pinpointing what are the mechanisms that Canada needs to secure its interests. I think that's an area that really needs to be explored a little bit more. We're favorable on many of the multilateral architecture. We're favorable with a lot of our partners, but we haven't pinpointed precisely what areas are most crucial for Canada to protect its interests.
No, that's interesting. And if you were to kind of go further into the Indo-Pacific realm that you cover, Jonathan, it seems like between China and Pakistan and others in the region, the Indo-Pacific seems, would you say, in Canadians' minds, a high priority? Is there a desire to move into these democratic partnerships in the way, with the type of enthusiasm that would compel policymakers and politicians to respond to?
I think so, but I think the challenge will be in the coming months is seeing this as an interconnected region. So I think we see high favorability, for example, with Australia, with Japan, with South Korea. But do Canadians see these countries as interconnected, and do they see their interests as interconnected with Canada? And I think this is, again, puts the impetus on the need for a strategy for the government to articulate how these interests, how all of these states and their equities in the region are all interconnected and in line with Canadian interests. So that's the point that I think needs to be followed through on, is not just do we have a scattering of different partners who are democracies and generally share values, but where these interests sort of intersect.
Great. No, that's wonderful. Thank you for that analysis. And Balkan, this is your second year running this poll. And you are probably the one person who's gone through these tabs more than anybody at the Institute. So I'd be very keen to hear kind of what you think has changed in the last year and some of your high-level impressions of this particular poll.
I would make 3 points very quickly on top of what Jonathan make the case. One is that what we see compared to last year is that Canadians are more concerned about the domestic developments and therefore are less engaged more broadly when it comes to foreign affairs. That did not necessarily change the direction of how Canadians think about international politics. Like Jonathan pointed out, Canadians are, broadly speaking, clear-eyed who our friends are and who our adversaries are. The intensity of those feelings seem to change a little bit, and that seems to emanate from the fact that we had a lot of different issues that we needed to deal with domestically, from vaccines to concerns about the inflation to other issues. So that will be one thing I would like to highlight. Another thing I'd like to highlight, and just piggybacking on what Jonathan pointed out, that from the data we can slowly sort of tease out which forums that Canadians think that Canada should engage more and promote its interests abroad. Support for AUKUS is a suggestion for this. The very, very positive view on Five Eyes is another one. About 6% of Canadians believe that Canada should be more active in NATO. So I think we do see which groups that we need to focus on and push forward. And lastly, I would argue that taken together, this poll suggests what should be the common ground for Canadian foreign policy. That is, largely supportive of a stronger, more principled foreign policy that positions Canadian interests at the center, stands up for our fellow democracies across the world, while working together with close allies and partners in these regions to stand up to regimes such as China and Russia.
Excellent. Thank you very much. At this point, I want to pause quickly to invite our viewers on a range of social media platforms to provide questions for our experts, Jonathan and Balkan, to respond to with respect to this poll. We'll have a chance to have a bit of a discussion now on this as we round the corner on our panel. I'll go to the first question that we have here, and this is from Akash, who asks, "It is a cliche that at elections, Canadians never vote with foreign policy in mind. If that is true, does it suggest that, notwithstanding what Canadians say between elections, the hard truth is that we neither want nor deserve a robust foreign policy?" Let me turn to you, Balkan, first to respond to that.
There you go. I think this is an excellent question and a very good observation that we need to sort of think more thoroughly. When we look at the data, and our audience can go and check it out, we did ask how important foreign policy is in how people vote in the federal elections. We did see a slight increase compared to last year. in terms of what we call a foreign policy voters. About 1 in 5 Canadians would be considered foreign policy voters. That is an important segment. 2 groups, I would say, well, 3 groups, I would say, are particularly interested in foreign policy, which is, I think, not surprising. One is New Canadians who have connections and new to the country, have a much more interest in foreign policy and how Canada works with others. Another group is the ones who are paying more attention and more engaged with foreign policy affairs. And therefore, they believe that foreign policy plays a bigger role in how they vote. So those are, I would say, the two important groups that we see when it comes to voting. I think it has to be a conversation with the politicians and the public about the role of the importance of foreign policy, and why what goes outside our borders is intimately tied to our security and prosperity. And therefore, it is incumbent on all of us to engage in this conversation and bring it to the public discussion, and in a way force the politicians to pay more attention to foreign policy when they're engaging with the public.
Well said. Well said. Thank you for that. Jonathan, do you have a reaction to that question? The one about, people don't care about foreign policy, therefore politicians don't talk about it. What's your sense on how this poll reflects that?
Yeah, 2 points. And I mean, one sort of building off Balkan's point, and then a separate point. I think, Balkan, you bring up a really key point that when thinking about foreign policy, and I think when framing foreign policy, and I think part of this needs to be done, from a political realm, part of this needs to be done from a civil society realm, is to not look at it, not bifurcate it from everything else. The reality is that foreign policy in today's world is intimately tied in with businesses, with civil society, and it is not just some sort of elite topic that deserves its own sort of focus that you had to go to school for 8 to 10 years to talk on. You only need to talk to soybean farmers or others to realize that foreign policy impacts everyone's bottom line very quickly. So that's one important thing. The second thing is that I think the way that Canadians, their attachment to foreign policy issues and when they really think they matter, it depends on when we're in a crisis. And I think whether it's because of our geography or whether it's because we think of some of these international issues, these security issues as quote unquote luxury items, are not necessarily critical to Canada's security. I think that thinking needs to change because I think we'll realize very quickly whether it's something in Eastern or Central Europe or whether it's something in the Indo-Pacific, very quickly these problems could become our problems. And in many ways actually are our problems right now. So I think that those 2 points I think are play out in the survey.
That's excellent. In fact, it springs really well, and I know you didn't intend to do this, Jonathan, to our next question from Kenneth, who hits on a topic that affects you both between your Indo-Pacific and transatlantic work. And the question is, if NATO extends its mission to the deterrence of Chinese aggression, will Canada support this extension of NATO's mission? So in your mind, Balkan, when you think about how the Transatlantic Alliance, NATO, thinks about these new fronts with the People's Republic of China, do you have a sense that Canadian public opinion would stand for an expansion of that type of NATO enlargement, that NATO mission?
I think Jonathan is better placed to understand how one of the Canadian official maybe line could go. But looking at the data, I would argue, combining 2 things, I would argue that if NATO alliance and the members decide to be more active in the Indo-Pacific as it became more and more likely, there would be support. I would make the case that this is true for 2 reasons. One, from the data, we know that the Canadians are, significant majorities of Canadians are supportive of working with other democracies in the Indo-Pacific. And the second is that we know that Canadians believe that Canada should play a more active role in NATO. And third, that Canada should stand with democracies, even if it means, if there is no strategic interest for us right away. So when you combine these things 3 in a region that is actually quite significant for Canada, working with allies that we have a very positive view and that we want to play a more active role in, I would suggest that if NATO decides to take such a track, there would be public support within the Canadian public for that move.
Thank you for that. Jonathan, what's your sense?
Well, 2 points on this. I think number one, of course, NATO does have its hands full right now, as we know, obviously in Europe, but not just in Europe, obviously with instability in Libya and in the Sahel as well. There's real challenges for NATO as an alliance closer to home. That being said, so I think that's an important point to say. That being said, there actually is a reality on the ground right now. I mean, quietly, NATO has already been talking about China for 10 to 15 years, and not so quietly in the last 5 years, this discussion continues. So it's not a question of if, it's how much. The discussion is already happening in NATO about China. NATO can't close its eyes to this discussion. The challenge is exactly how that articulates itself. So right now, NATO does have partnerships with key Indo-Pacific democracies such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia, not technically part of NATO, but partner countries. How this plays out in the coming years with the varying priorities that NATO has is going to be interesting and is going to be a challenge. But I think, as I said, this is a how much and not an if question.
And if I may jump in here, I think the model like Quad and AUKUS provide templates in which NATO as an institution can also engage in similar relations and partnerships with partners in the region more institutionally. And I think having these organizations such as AUKUS and Quad provides sort of a training ground for further NATO involvement more at the institutional level if the alliance choose to do so.
Excellent. Thanks, Balkan. We'll move on to the next question from Hugh, who asks, can Canada have any constructive impact on global trends and challenges without a massive expenditure in our military, international development, and foreign affairs capacity and reach? So this kind of, Balkan, goes to the slide that you presented on the ambition Canadians have on things like defense spending. How would you respond to Hugh?
I mean, capabilities are essential in both protecting our core interests as well as shaping the international environment that is conducive to our national interest. And that requires, of course, investment in all the three areas that our audience highlights. I would suggest that, yes, we do need more investments, both capital investments in the actual sort of capabilities, not on the military side, but also on the foreign side and on the development side, but also human capital investments in these areas for the Canadian Armed Forces personnel, for our foreign policy officers, and expand on that. Because if you don't have the resources to be able to bring to the table, it is unlikely that others will listen to you. You should be able to contribute in a meaningful way on the defense level, on the actively diplomatic engagement level, as well as international development level. And we need to have that conversation. And whether are we providing our men and women in the Foreign Office, in the Canadian Armed Forces and other places with the necessary resources to be able to do their job and protect Canadian and promote Canadian interests. And the current answer, I would say, is no, and therefore we really need to step up our game. So I think our audience touches upon a very, very important part.
Jonathan, when you hear Balkan, I think indicating that to have a bigger impact on global affairs, more investments are needed. And at the same time, you know that in Canadian public opinion, the price of things are going up, that they become less interested in foreign policy issues abroad when major domestic considerations like inflation and others are underpinning things at home. How would you find a way to win a Nobel Prize and answer that question for politicians? And the ambition for Canada to succeed in the world versus our domestic needs and our needs to be able to survive through things like the pandemic and our hopefully soon economic recovery.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with 90% of what Balkan said, but a slightly different take. And Hugh, I really like the framing of your question, because the fact that you put in defense, diplomatic, and development, I think is really crucial. Because often when people talk about foreign policy, I get the question of, where's the defense spending? Why don't we just spend more and more on defense? Defense is very important, and I think to Balkan's point, we do need to be spending more, I think, in all three of these areas to secure our interests. But it's not purely about spending more money. I think Shuv hits on a really good point in his question. The reality is that there are a lot of things that, as a government, we're going to need to be spending our money on, and frankly, we're going to be in for a few bumpy years going forward. So it's going to become more and more scarce. So I think the second important question is allocation, and how we go about that allocation. And frankly, there's going to be some really difficult questions that have to be asked, whether this is from a diplomatic footprint standpoint, whether this is our development envelope and where that's traditionally been put to, or whether that's in the defense realm. Exactly where are we allocating that money? How is that done? And is it done the most efficiently? And that leads me to a last point, is the need to actually work much more with the private sector. I think in particular on defense, but I think in all three of these areas, the idea of engaging the private sector and having ventures between public and private sector can be very, very helpful and start to sort of move some of the inertia that is happening and actually spending quite a bit of millions of dollars of waste, frankly.
It's a really important question, Jonathan. I think, in 2022 at the Institute, we'll be spending some time going through those types of issues, exactly saying, what are the new and novel partnerships that Canadians can engage in to advance our interests around the world. And it's not always about hard defense investments, even a lot of that I think could be rethought. But it's also about who we partner in the private sector, how we deploy capital through international development, and to do so in ways that actually maximize all of Canada rather than just the government of Canada or just the taxpayer of Canada. So thank you for that. It's an incredible insight. The next question.
Can I just jump in here very quickly? I think to highlight one theme that we in the Institute keep coming back, and that is a clear understanding of what Canadian interests are, a foreign policy review that is way overdue, that prioritize what the Canadian interests are, and then match the resources to those interests in order to deal with this various competing priorities domestically. I think will be an extremely important point to start. And having that, layout requires a more inclusive and comprehensive engagement, I think, with the public. So it cannot be really just, three guys sitting in a room and deciding these should be the priorities. But that engagement should really include the private sector, should include civil society, should include the public at large to identify those foreign policy interests and how we can use the whole of society approach and partnerships with private sector and civil society to pursue and utilize our resources at the maximum efficiency. I think we should start at that top level in order to match these resources effectively and efficiently.
Thanks, Balkan. Much appreciated. Entirely out of order, but I'll take it. Amal asks, and Jonathan, I'll come to you with this one. Is there a way to better communicate to everyday Canadians the importance and the impact of Canadian foreign policy and international affairs in their everyday lives? And if so, how should we approach it? It's a great question from Amal.
Well, again, I think going back to a point I made before is rather than seeing and sort of disaggregating foreign policy as sort of some elite domain that can only be discussed in the halls of a foreign ministry, or by a few who teach foreign policy, is making this a much more sort of common discussion. I think the foreign policy discussions involving civil society, frankly, in these discussions is very important. And in some of the ways that we just talked about, I mean, articulating our interests and making sure that the government is up to the task. This is not just about ventures with private sector in a business standpoint. This is also engaging with civil society leaders. So something that our allies do particularly well, whether this is the Americans, whether this is others in the Five Eyes or those in Europe, is actually actively engage and recruit members of civil society to engage in the bureaucracy. This is something that we have not done a good job in Canada. And that way, by doing that, civil society feels much more engaged in the process of government, in the process of foreign policy, rather than this being something controlled by, 4,000 bureaucrats that are focused on this. So this is one sort of tangible recommendation that I think that we could move forward on.
It's let me drill you a little bit further on this one with both you and Balkan, because I think this is a harder thing to unlock, and I think it's a really critical question. Meaning, we often hear in the commentary at class that there's no discussions on foreign policy and Canadians are not engaged. And this is, I think, the second question that basically touches upon the same thing: is how do we engage Canadians on their priorities? I think this poll is one part of that, where we actually look at the views and attitudes of Canadians. And offer it to policymakers as a baseline for how they could respond to the priorities of ordinary Canadians. We've broken out by demography. There's plenty to look at in terms of what public policy leaders can do to serve the public. But let me ask you this in another way. When you say civil society and we say private sector in Canada, what are we talking about really? Are we talking about community, cultural, religious organizations that comprise the fabric of Canada? Are we talking about industries and sectors? When you think about engaging Canadians on their interests, how do we help our officials get out of Fort Pearson and really get into the grassroots of the country to ask and then to receive direction from Canadians on what their priorities are? Would you have any novel ideas, Balkan? I'm going to come to you first and then Jonathan second.
I mean, of course, this is the $64,000 question, how to do that. I would argue two ways. One is to have a sort of broader and inclusive understanding of when we talk about civil society. So it's not only think tanks and the chattering classes like us engaging with it, or the universities or the media, but those local organizations, those diaspora organizations, those religious and cultural organizations that are at the grassroots, that pay attention and have a much more closer relationship with the everyday life of the people. So we need to sort of include them in a much more broad sense. Listen to how the developments at the international level have an impact on their daily lives. The second part is, of course, how to get the politicians out and talk and listen to. Well, that is actually, I think, the harder part, and that requires the people more broadly, the public at large, to make it clear that this actually matters to them, and this would matter in their voting behavior. Politicians, like everyone else, responds to incentive structures. And if they don't think, and I think we're showing that a lot of the Canadians do care about foreign policy, if they don't think that something would have an effect on their voting behavior, they are not inclined to go and talk. So this sort of myopic approach, looking at the next elections, is of course inimical to the democratic legitimacy of the foreign policy developments. But it also is incumbent on the people to make this case by engaging with their votes and showing the politicians that it matters to them, that they do listen to them on the foreign policy issues as well.
How about you, Jonathan?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think going back to the idea of sort of demystifying foreign policy, but a heavier lift, which I think is necessary, and this is not a 1 to 2 year effort, this is a 30 to 40 year effort, it goes down to the education system. So I think the three of us are old enough to remember probably when we had our first computer science class. And I remember when I was studying this and be like, oh, this is not something I need to be spending my time on. But as we know now, I mean, learning about technology informs everything we do. I mean, we're doing a live webinar right now. And I think foreign policy, I'm not trying to equate it with computers and technology, but we need to realize that this is not just some niche thing. The world around us, the way that we study this in school, whether this is from elementary up to high school, up to university, often starts with learning flags or learning geography and learning history. That's all important, but we need to understand, we need to educate at the earliest level how the world around us works and how that informs and shapes our own world. And I just don't think that we do this at the education level at this point. So I think we need to put a priority at the early stages of education. I'm not trying to say that we put geopolitics in grade 2, but I think that we need to really let students understand how the world around them impacts them.
No, it's interesting. I'm here in Alberta, and they recently conducted a massive review of their education process in this province. And in it, they have spent a lot of time reflecting on the important issues of Canadian society, Canadian history, our relationships with our First Nations. But they've also put in, a much more broad-based perspective around, what is the story of civilizations and how does ours fit into it? And touching more upon some of those classical areas or things that could be restored in the education systems across Canada. Of course, we're the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We focus on national public policy, but certainly we can look at each of our provinces as incubators, and at least I admire what's happening here in Alberta. Let me turn to the next question, and this one comes from Andrew. And a few of us have been involved in some writing on the topics of middle powers to major powers. Andrew asks, does developing a middle power foreign policy matter today in the face of growing power politics and strategic competition among the world's major powers? Jonathan, let me turn to you as a co-author of a paper we put together on middle to major powers. What does this mean for Canadians in terms of how they think about themselves in a world in which superpowers are becoming great powers and new powers are emerging to the landscape, which may lead itself to our relative decline in that position? So what does a middle power foreign policy really mean in this contemporary time?
Well, I love this, and I'm part of the class that's guilty of making these sort of names that all of a sudden the states that you named don't really enjoy it. I mean, you talk about middle powers, and then most of the ones that are claimed as middle powers, whether they're Canada, Japan, South Korea, sometimes India has been framed as a middle power, and none of them like the term middle power. Most of them don't like it, and I have a few problems with it. I mean, the reality is, I think post-Cold War, there was an idea that we could exist in this sort of neutral state where we could, promote international institutions. We were generally free of large-scale geopolitical threats. But the reality is, and this is especially acute for Canada, but I think it's true for most of the middle powers that or quote unquote middle powers that I just named, is that it's not a sense of neutrality. The reality is that states have interests. And most of those interests are very much tied to their institutions and to their geographies. So for Canada, yes, we do engage, and we have some differences, obviously, with our neighbor to the south. But the reality is, if you were to compare us with the two great powers now, the United States and China, there is no neutral territory. There is no middle ground. We're in North America. We have one border, and we have a longstanding ally. It's not always our best friend, but it's the United States. So I think we really need to clearly think about, when we talk about middle power diplomacy, what exactly are we referring to? Is it an opportunity to work with other states like Japan, for example, in Canada's perspective, like states in Europe, to provide things that are complementary in many ways to democracy and to institution building? Yes, but I don't think we should overstate it either.
Good. Balkan, I'm going to put this question back to you in a different sense here. 67% of Canadians in our poll report that foreign policy was at least moderately important to them to informing their vote in 2021. 67%, at least moderately important. How do you think, what are the opportunities that we can engage with for politicians to seize on, the 2/3 of Canadians who have articulated that they do care about these issues as something they want to see in their national debate?
I think one of the issues that we would like to highlight this poll and get it to the attention of the policymakers and politicians is this very fact that there is this, the ones who say it's very important is about 1/5 of Canadians, but 2/3 of Canadians at least put some moderate levels of importance to foreign policy when they're voting, and bringing this to the attention of the politicians to highlight the fact that there is a desire, there is an attempt by the public to engage more with the public when it comes to foreign policy, with the foreign policy issues, and therefore enable those entrepreneuring and politicians to capitalize on that by listening to these people who said that it is important for them, at least moderately, when they're voting, and developing policies that would involve the public more clearly in setting up Canadian foreign policy priorities is one thing. If I were to be a politician, that pay attention, sit down and read this poll very closely, look at who is paying attention, and how I would sit down and think how I can engage with those people, listen to them, and try to bring their concerns into the parliament, into governing, into our public discussion at the political level.
Yeah,
but it's time to do that.
It's a lot of work to do that. Jonathan, we're coming around to the conclusion of this webinar, so we got maybe one, maybe two questions left. But Jonathan, let me turn to you with the next question from the audience, which are, from your vantage point, what are the major partisan differences on foreign policy? When you look at principally liberals, then conservatives, what's your sense as to what actually differentiates these two parties competing for power in Canada? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I think it's a really good question, and I think you may read newspapers and feel like there's real stark differences and that the camps are irreconcilable. But the reality is, I think there's actually quite a bit of bipartisan consensus on many of these issues. Whether it's the challenges of Russia, the challenges of China, some of the adversaries that we mentioned, Iran, etc. But I think the difference is the tools to approach those challenges. So there can be a recognition of those challenges, but how serious, how severe they are, how critical they are to Canadian interests, and what tools we use to mitigate those challenges, I think, are different. And I think this goes back to many of the discussions that we had over the past hour, is that, yes, Canada is a fan of multilateral clubs and institutions like the United Nations, and they have done and continue to do some good work, but the reality is that they may be necessary, but clearly are insufficient to deal with most of these challenges. And I think Canadians recognize that point. So this is something that I think there's a growing bipartisan sort of convergence on this, but I wouldn't say consensus. Where I believe the Conservatives, for example, are still are showing a lot of interest in alignments such as the Quad that we discussed earlier, AUKUS and others, whereas I think the Liberals tend to still be a little bit quiet on these institutions.
Balkan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Maybe two things. One, just to add to what Jonathan said, the bipartisan nature, cross-partisan nature of most of the views is, I think, clear. There's only one exception, seems to be, and that's the views on the United Nations. That's where we really see the difference between liberals and conservatives. I think that goes sort of more deeply in history. The second thing I would suggest is that what really differentiates between different voters by party affiliation is the intensity that they feel towards particular issues, which vary according to the party. Some on some issues, conservatives are more intensely held onto their beliefs. On other issues, liberals remain the same, but the direction seems to be in the same way, which is a very important point to highlight when we look at other countries such as the United States that have a very sharp partisan divide when it comes to foreign policy issues. In Canada, there's a lot more common ground across the party lines on what our core interests are. And as Jonathan highlighted, the difference seems to be on what are the mechanisms to defend those interests and how strongly those beliefs are held. But the direction seems to be quite cross-party lines.
So a consensus on a strong principled foreign policy for Canada in the world, with a differentiation on emphasis between Canadians of different walks of life and partisan affiliations. Fascinating conversation, gentlemen. I want to thank you both very, very much for the work that you put into this. Yet another shout out to Brett Byers-Lane, who has been indispensable in both polls, this one and the previous one. I want to encourage viewers to go to www. Macdonald-Laurier.ca to do two things. one, buy Brett a cup of coffee, and two, download this poll. Read it carefully, share it with your networks, and engage us. Engage us on a dialogue, on a debate, and a discussion around what our findings have revealed. We look forward to interacting with each and every one of you through social media or through private correspondence, and I'll leave it at that. So thank you, everybody. Thanks once again to the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and Happy New Year. Great way to kick off this year by taking a good assessment as to what the last year meant for Canadians in December. Dr. Devlen, Dr. Berkshire Miller, my compliments, my gratitude, colleagues, and to everybody else. Stay safe and see you soon.